if you can explain what is the crack?
Hey, the crack.
How can I have the crack? What's the crack?
What is the crack? You are the crack.
Welcome back to Audio Crack. As always, guys, please subscribe to the podcast on Spotify or Apple. Check out our YouTube because this is probably going to be a very visual episode. Shout out producer Nikki Quinn. We're going to be getting some pretty interesting topics on our ancient evolutionary past. And we have a very special guest with us today, Zeke Darwin, at Zeke Darwin Science on TikTok. And I've seen his TikToks. It's about some mind-blowing topics, stuff that really makes you think about not only humanity now, but humanity millions of years ago, about domestication, animals, how animals are the way they are today, all the animals we lost throughout history. Zeke Darwin is, I would say, one of the foremost experts on evolution I've found on TikTok. So I just really want to jog his brain. Zeke, thanks for coming on.
Yeah, good clarification at the end, the experts you found, because I certainly don't want to misrepresent myself here. I am a science teacher that kind of fell into this interest after college, really. But because everything is published online now, because the actual experts are so accessible on like Twitter and various social media platforms, I've really been able to learn a lot about it. So yeah, I mean, I'm not an expert in the sense that I have the degrees that other experts truly have, more that I've just had a lot of time to kind of take this stuff in, learn about it. And then having the platform on TikTok has given me a place to kind of break it down and share it with others. So,
I mean, what originally got you into this kind of stuff?
So science was back with just like, you and I had the same minds, frog minds, animal minds.
Mm-hmm.
So I kind of decided I wanted to be a teacher. Science was seemingly the right fit. But then it wasn't until I got my first teaching job and I was in Topeka, Kansas. And I was actually just a little ways down the street from the Westboro Baptist Church. And like, I know when we're in school, it seems like science teachers, they know everything, but they don't. And especially in the first year, you're doing a lot of kind of relearning this stuff. So being so close to a group that was so like anti-evolution and had been in the news through a lot of my childhood, it was kind of scary. So my initial diving into this topic was to just kind of try to educate myself so I could be more prepared, so I could have those discussions with people who disagreed with what I was teaching. But once I stepped into it, I realized there was so much cool stuff we know that I had never learned in school and that just the normal everyday person never hears about. And that is really when my fascination into like evolution, and then more specifically human evolution in our last 3 million years or so, that's where that took off. So that's kind of how I got that weird placement in this niche, in this content creation.
So when we talk about human history, how far back would you say is our like recorded human history, like from now? And the thing is, the reason I want to bring that up is that it's so little compared to how long Homo sapien has been on this planet. And that's something. So there's a lot of missing gaps.
Yes. And I'm glad you're starting with this because I actually had a paper written down that said like right off the bat, ask Billy what a human is to him, because the reality is like this topic is so nuanced. Even among the experts, they have different ideas for what is a human, but amongst like, I don't know, it just leads to a lot of miscommunication. So for me, I go with what I have seen to be like the most generally accepted definition of human, which is any animal in our genus. So if it is lumped into Homo, it is technically a human. So in that sense, human history goes back between like 2.5 and 3 million years. But even with that definition right there, there's some kind of oddballs like Naledi, which we can talk about later. There's a lot of ongoing debate that often doesn't kind of get represented in the mainstream, but like amongst the earliest members of our genus, like Homo habilis, they could easily be lumped into Australopithecus. There is no like clear dividing line. We just have these kind of a small representation of fossils, and we've decided to place them into the genus Homo. So we can get all into that stuff later, but to answer your question, human history, I would say it goes back about 2.8 million years. And then, like you said, sapiens, we seem to arise somewhere around 300,000 years ago.
And we, like, going back, we probably only have at most 10,000 years of recorded history.
Yeah. You get back into like the civilization, Mesopotamia stuff. Yeah. Like going back beyond 10,000, it's not really recorded. We have cave drawings, we have paintings and stuff in caves, but not that level of detail that we start to see when like writing becomes a thing.
I mean, that's wild that like there's 300,000 years of Homo sapiens and we only have 10,000. So like we have, I mean, I don't even know what the percentage of that is, but it's like 0.03% of our entire history is recorded. We have some sort of idea.
It's a tiny fragment. I will say what has made this field way more interesting over the last 10 years, because when you're looking at that huge gap with just like sparse fossils throughout the place, it's hard to really draw hard conclusions. But our ability to now like get DNA from some of these fossils, especially those within the caves, it's not recorded in writing, but we are able to like start seeing when species hybridize. We can start kind of tracking movement across places based on genetics and haplotypes. And so to your point, it's not like recorded in writing, like what we consider with civilization, but it really is kind of this new look at our recorded history through DNA, through these splits through time.
And honestly, now that I'm doing the research, we do have writings dating back 10,000, but the time period I was thinking of Mesopotamia, the Tigris and Euphrates, and the cradle of civilization was around 5,000 years ago.
And that's about where we start learning about this in school too, right? So it's just like such a small fragment of our history that we learn about. And honestly, that's why that stuff's never been all that interesting to me. To me, it's the stuff before that.
So what time period did you start being like, wait a second, like this is going on? Like where were you like, all right, pre-Mesopotamia, when did you get into it?
Really, I would say two waves of our history throughout this time. So first off, like the first line of interest was those really early humans. And even going back before humans, when we have no evidence of humans on the planet, but we have like the Australopithecus and Paranthropus in Africa, I find that time period really interesting to learn about. But then there's like this kind of almost like a doldrum, it seems like, from the outside, where I don't find it as interesting until you get to really our species leaving Africa, like when we solidly left Africa, which tends to be, they think now we may have like left and kind of settled in a pocket around 90,000 years ago and then really left around 60 or 50,000 years ago. But that's when everything gets super interesting again, because our species starts running into other species, some similar, some really weird, some genetic evidence we hybridized, some none of that. But it's just a really cool time period to really dive into, because it's like sci-fi. It's like your Dungeons and Dragons. You're walking around, you end up on an island that no sapiens have been on before. And there's this species of little short 3.5 foot tall human with big feet that have been on that island for 700,000 years, getting smaller and smaller. That like doesn't seem like it should be real life.
Homo florensis, the Hobbit.
Floresiensis. Yeah.
I mean, I want to know, one of the first things I want to ask you about, because I know you'd have way better insight, is the Human Neanderthal War real? The concept that humans were moving into Europe and just were in a constant battle with Neanderthals for like thousands of years until humans won out? Or is it a little different than a straight up?
I think like a lot of these things, it's a really oversimplified, and sometimes like we put more of an emphasis on like the war aspect because it sounds cool. It sounds almost like a Game of Thrones type scenario. I think what the evidence seems to suggest is that there was this kind of confrontation of two different groups of humans that are wanting the same resources. And this one population is expanding out of Africa, moving into the other region. But I think the most important part is about what was happening before then. Right. Sapiens, our general idea is that we were living in kind of larger communities, more interconnected, more diversity. There have been recent studies that kind of show how as a species, we kind of, instead of just evolving in East Africa, it's more like we kind of evolved in this interconnected web across Africa. So we have all of this biodiversity. We have this cooperation amongst groups. Now, Neanderthals are really similar to us, so they were cooperating with each other as well, but their environment is very different. And it's not homologous. It's not for all of the populations, but just in general, living further north during this time period of ice ages and glacial maximums, you're kind of having to deal with more stresses. And there's genetic evidence that these Neanderthals, especially around the time when sapiens were expanding, they were kind of within a period of the opposite, where they were kind of having smaller and more fragmented populations. And I'm sure there were some occasions where sapiens fought Neanderthals for a cave, because as we can see with some of these caves, some of them were like used for tens of thousands of years by multiple species. But I think the less interesting take is more that just like our population numbers, because we were hybridizing, because we were intermixing, we didn't really know we were different species. We were mating, we're humans, we're animals, the admixture's there. It shows we were interbreeding. So I think it's more just that over time, our population expanded and pretty much absorbed the rest of the Neanderthals, where it's that nuance where it's like, yes, they went extinct. There are no Neanderthals today, but in a way, they were just kind of absorbed into this larger population of close relatives.
Now, how exactly? So they talk about like there's a good chunk of the human population with Neanderthal DNA. And this is something I always wonder about. We share, 98% of our DNA with chimpanzees?
It's one of those things with a lot of nuance where when we get those numbers, it depends on the methods they're using. But yeah, they typically say between like 96 and 98% of the genome is like shared or in common. Depends on whether they count all the duplicates. There's some complexity in there.
So when they talk about the small percentage, is that like, we already share, let's say 96% with chimps, right? So then if some people have 1.2% Neanderthal DNA, does that mean that you have 1.2% of your 4% that isn't chimpanzee? So it's like, I know it sounds complicated, but they say it's a very minuscule amount, but because we share so much with the chimpanzee, and let's say Neanderthals have the exact same amount shared with a chimpanzee as well, is that 1.2% difference? Like, that's like a 50% of our human DNA. Do you know what I'm saying?
Yeah, I'm following your logic there. So my first question would be like, are those on the same scale? Because I don't know whether they are. When we're looking at like the genome of sapiens versus Neanderthals and then sapiens versus chimpanzees, I truly don't know if it's on the same scale. Assuming they are, just to kind of follow that line of reasoning, my assumption would be that like that 1.2% or whatever it is, instead of being like added on, it's more of like replacing 1.2% of that sapiens genome. So I wouldn't say it makes more or less as far as like the relation to the chimpanzee. It's more just like a substitute of those genes that are already counted as like specific to humans. But again, that's kind of where some of these things, there's so much nuance. It's like the whole 60% of that we share 60% of our DNA with a banana. You see that fact shared everywhere. I've tried. I've never been able to really substantiate that. I think it kind of just came from a simplified claim that wasn't meant to be misleading early on, and then has just always been taken as truth. So I don't know. When you get into those percents, it's tough.
Like in my mind, I'm like, okay, so like if I have 1.2% Neanderthal DNA and I'm 96% chimpanzee, and Neanderthals are probably 96% chimpanzee, does that mean that I'm 97.2% the same as a Neanderthal? And there's like a 2% difference that makes me human? Sapiens?
I think it's got to be. It must be more focused on the humans, because I don't think that is the way it is. I think it's more just on that human level. We're just find those differences.
Well, so this world where humans and sapiens are coming out of Africa, Homo sapien is leaving Africa after being in a pocket and is encountering other hominids that have left already. Who are the cast of characters that are being encountered by early man?
All right. So trying to make sure let me just kind of start a little before then, because I'll walk through it, because there's some of these like segments that left earlier in our past And then we kind of come across. So like all of these exits out of Africa kind of need to be accounted for, or else the story is more confusing. So we'll start 3 million years ago. There are no humans yet, no animals in the Homo genus. Africa has these Australopithecines, and they're kind of grouped into what we used to call robust and gracile, and more like I'm going to mispronounce it, but gracile. We now call those robust ones Paranthropus. So to put it simple, there are Australopithecus species and there's Paranthropus species, and Paranthropus are almost like an offshoot of Australopithecus that are somewhat more gorilla-like. Like they've got these really big jaws. They've got these really big crests on their skull, big muscles attached to them. Doesn't really matter for our story. But they're in Africa. One group of Australopithecus eventually transitions not towards like the transition we see when we go to Paranthropus, but a more human-like, a more what we would kind of consider human. And those fossils that are like more human-like, but also kind of Australopithecus-like, typically get lumped into habilis. So now we're in Africa with the first of our genus, habilis, and the next one you kind of hear about is erectus. And this is kind of where our story starts more, because erectus is more like truly human. Really, within a few 100,000 years, we already see erectus leaving Africa. We see erectus up in Eurasia. They start making it down to Java quick. So they were the first real like travelers of this ancient world. And some of them stayed in Africa. Some of them stayed in Europe. Some of them are out in Java. They're becoming new species. We don't really have a very clear picture of that, other than the assumption that if they're spread out, they're going to kind of continue accumulating differences. Now we step forward to a population somewhere in Africa or Eurasia is now transitioning to Heidelbergensis. And Heidelbergensis is what's often kind of considered the common ancestor of us and Neanderthals and those Denisovans. So Heidelbergensis lives up all the way up in Europe, all the way down in South Africa based off of the fossils.
Wow. So it's that far spread.
Mm-hmm.
So just to like give a better understanding, a better image, we have Erectus, the one with the funny name. So that's like is that like a Geico caveman looking guy, or is he a little more ape-like? I
would say the Geico caveman, I think he is more representative of the Neanderthal. So we take that, and then they seem to have like a longer body, taller proportions. Neanderthals were kind of more adapted to the cold. They're more of a condensed version. So almost like a taller version of Neanderthals. They're pretty human-like. We'd probably see them about as different as we see the Geico caveman. So that's probably a fair representation.
So these I keep thinking of like Walter White. These Heidelberg dudes, they're living in Europe and down to South Africa. They have left Africa, something that Erectus has also already done, correct?
Yeah, and that kind of comes down to, did they evolve in Africa and leave Africa? Did they evolve in this region that kind of includes North Africa and parts of Eurasia and then spread both ways? It's hard to really know for sure. It's typically accepted that just kind of in that region. It's hard to pinpoint that down with the data we have.
So let's say they evolved in this cradle in Northern Africa and have gone to Europe, are they then going back down to South Africa, or they just are spreading north and south from a central location?
I would assume spreading north and south from a central location. Mm-hmm. There's a paper from a few years ago that's one of my favorite papers that I've ever read, that kind of like, they look at climate models and they try to model this expansion. And it was essentially showing that kind of the northern, eastern Africa region, and then just kind of spreading out. Mm-hmm. But really, it's probably they're following kind of shifts in the environment that are driven by the climate and these climate cycles.
Is it true that these Homo heidelbergensis might have been giants and 7 feet tall?
There is I want to say it's like a femur or a leg bone. There's like one specific one that was found by one of the Leakeys. I'm pretty sure we may need to fact check that, but a big name in paleoanthropology. And I know initially, like when they tried to determine the size of the individual based on the size of this bone, it had tall proportions. I don't know for sure if it was 7 foot tall, but it was like a very tall version of this individual. If we can truly kind of trust that extrapolation of data from the bone. But I mean, we got tall people today. It's not unreasonable to think that some populations, maybe even some of the same mutations that can lead to like some super tall people today.
Yeah. So Lee R. Berger of the University of Witwatersrand found numerous fossils and bones that indicated that some populations of Heidelbergensis were giants, routinely over 2.13 meters tall, 7 feet, and inhabit South Africa. That's pretty insane. If there was just giants, like
I would need to look into that. Lee Berger is a guy I've talked to a decent amount. Mm-hmm. He has been very controversial in the field over the last couple of years, but he's also done some really cool work.
Oh, is he like what kind of controversy has he brought?
Not too terrible. The Naledi. So like the idea that this species that was really strangely non-human like was burying their dead and using fire. He proposed that based on some really cool evidence. I can still remember the night he had a presentation where he presented that. I was watching it. Mm-hmm. He also sent some bones from an Australopithecus to space or to the edge of space within the last year. And that kind of frustrated a lot of people. They just didn't see the reason for it. But I guess what I'm saying is he's a well-known paleoanthropologist. So I hadn't seen really his connection to this. I usually hear of what I think is like an erectus leg bone from like 100 years ago or so that the Leakeys found. But I don't know. It's interesting to think about too. Like if Shaq was fossilized and some civilization in the future found like his leg bone, what would they think? Would they think we're all just massive? Or I don't know. It gets tough with this field. So often you need to like look at really a large amount of data before you make too big of a conclusion. The Denisovans are something we can get into eventually too, where some people claim they were giants based off of these kind of extrapolating a lot of info from a little bit of fossil.
So you have Heidelbergensis up in Europe, down South Africa. You know, Erectus has already left Africa. They're sort of encroaching onto Eurasia. Then what's our next chapter?
All right. So this is where we prepare for us to get on the scene. Put some emphasis on the fact that there's still some oddballs outside of Africa. You've got the ancestors of Floresiensis out there and stuff. Mm-hmm. But now you have, and this is where that paper I talked about with the climate models, there seems to be this population we talked about that was really expanding north-south from South Africa up into Eurasia. Mm-hmm. They seem to kind of be fragmented. North Africa seems like the most likely thing here, where this region is just becoming not a very suitable place for our ancestors. So they're living there less and less, and it creates this divide. And this is where the pocket within Africa, we start seeing a bunch of these populations of these descendants of likely Heidelbergensis that are continuing to move around. And they are going to, over the next few 100,000 years, evolve into what we would consider today sapiens. And there's no it's not Pokemon, you're not hitting level 16 or whatever. Right. And all of a sudden you have sapiens, but there's just this slow blend, like looking at blue and green on a color gradient. There is no one moment, but at the end we have sapiens. At the beginning, we have this more ancient species. So sapiens are now on the scene in Africa. We'll go 300,000 years ago is this chapter. Early sapiens up in Europe, those cousins that were kind of split off from us up north, they have continued evolving. They are what we call the Neanderthals. But it doesn't really end right there, because they were up north in Eurasia. There's another group that splits off from the Neanderthals. And they split off, seems like pretty maybe within 100,000 years of that split between our species and Neanderthals. We have another split from that Neanderthal group. They go out into East Asia. They seem to be on like the islands of Oceania all the way up into Siberia, and we consider those the Denisovans. So the sapiens, Neanderthals, and Denisovans, That's like our cousin group. And we are in those places 300,000 years ago, somewhere around there. Now, at the same time, kind of talking about the cast of characters, let's start with Africa. This is Naledi. This is the really weird one that Lee Berger has done a lot of work on. We don't know. We do know. We know a ton about Naledi, but there's also a ton of mystery about Naledi because we have thousands of fossils from them. They are like one of the most well-represented ancient hominins in the fossil record. But every single one of those fossils comes from this same cave system, these couple of chambers they've been looking through deep down in this cave. So what we know about them based on here, this is a skull from Naledi. So you can see just how different it is from like what we see today with the humans around. The face is very different. It's got that brow ridge. They're also very small. They have shoulders that seem to be more adapted for like climbing and that life in trees still, but they also have adaptations that are very human-like. So at this time where we are in Africa, that thing is there too. Somewhere in South Africa, all of the evidence we have comes from this one cave system, but they are there. We don't know whether we interacted with them or not. There's a lot more work coming from that cave system that is going to, I think, lead to some amazing finds. They have evidence of like charcoal that suggests they may have actually been using fire down there. There are like little like stoves that were being cooked on. They've claimed they found the burials. There's a small infant skull that seems to have been like left up on a almost like a ledge in one of the chambers. We don't know yet. Like it seems to be this Naledi was doing some really human things for a species that doesn't seem human-like at the same time as our species was there. It's a lot more to prove, though. So Naledi is with us in Africa. And then you pretty much got to go to the islands to find most of the other weird hominins we know of. That's where we have Floresiensis 300,000 years ago. They would have been the small-bodied, what we sometimes call the hobbit people, about 3.5 feet tall, big feet, goofy looking things. They're out there on the island of Flores, just evolving on their own. And then we have Luzonensis, which is another species that seems to be similar to Floresiensis, but they're just on a different island, the island of Luzon. And they also seem to have undergone some of those adaptations that lead to a smaller body size. Both, well, I guess I could save this for the next chapter if we're ready to kind of move into the interactions there. All right. So then the final thing we have here, this kind of final era, we've talked about kind of the beginnings of our species, set the scene. Now we have our species starting to leave Africa. And we used to always say this happened about 70,000 years ago, give or take. We now, thanks to this ancient DNA and this like ancient evidence of hybridization, the evidence suggests like 200 plus thousand years ago, our species and Neanderthals actually began meeting up every once in a while, interbreeding. And we actually have our DNA go into the Neanderthals. And by the time we meet up later, about 6% of the Neanderthal genome is actually sapiens, kind of like what we see today. So there's like those early interactions, probably aided by the climate. And then we kind of fast forward to the real, the group of sapiens that leaves and seems to lead most to like the modern day sapiens. I don't want to say 100%, but pretty close to 100% come from this wave that leaves closer to 70,000 years ago. They kind of settle in a region up in northern Africa. It seems like maybe for 10,000 years or so, we have this kind of pocket of genetic evidence that suggests they were almost kind of like paused, not spreading too much. But then the floodgates open and sapiens move up into Europe. They move even before Europe. They are moving out through like Indonesia, Sundaland, into Australia. So they're spreading all over. And as they're spreading, they're coming across some of these ancient species that they had been separated from for a long time. And we know that because of the evidence of hybridization. We know we hybridized with Neanderthals during this time. We know we hybridized with at least a couple groups of Denisovans that seem to have been pretty separated from each other. So some diverse groups of Denisovans. And there are some what we call like ghost species, which is like where we see evidence of interbreeding between other species, but we only like know one member. We don't have a match for the second member. We don't have a fossil with that DNA evidence. The Denisovans were a good example of that, where it took us finding a little tiny bone and getting some DNA from it to realize like, oh, we're dealing with an entirely different species up here.
Wow.
So that's kind of like the end then of the time with us and these other hominins. We get to the island of Flores. They're very quickly gone. Floresiensis is extinct. No evidence. We interbred with them. They've tried to find evidence and haven't found any. Doesn't mean they'll never find evidence, but don't have any so far. And then it's kind of just a lot of migrating around until humans make it into the Americas, which is another kind of really cool time period I like learning about, where the evidence is really coming in quickly and we're getting kind of new evidence thanks to all of this ancient DNA and these better abilities to date methods. But that entrance into the Americas, you know, they used to teach that was around 13 or 14,000 years ago. And we're now realizing it was probably over 20,000 years ago, maybe over 30,000.
Do you think that any other hominids got to the mainland of North America before, Homo sapien? Like, do you think there was a Homo erectus group that got into the United States and I don't know, like maybe had a breeding population, got pretty hairy, also had some big feet, and we may have encountered them?
I see where you're going with that.
just wondering if just like maybe bigger than the Hobbit, but also having big feet, like some sort of Sasquatch type looking character in North America.
I mean, it would be fast. I don't like the Bigfoot thing would be sick as well. But even just if we found any other species had made it here, I think it's one of those things I like talking about, and there's just really not a whole lot of evidence to pull from. But I don't think it's crazy to think that like Denisovans could have made it here. They were up in Siberia from 300, 200,000 years ago up until 40,000 years ago when we kind of met with them. It's not unreasonable to think that they could have made the same path we made, especially when the climate shifts have been kind of coming and going.
When there was that the Bering Sea land bridge, was there any other hominids moving around at that period, or would it only coincide with Homo sapiens making the trek?
No, so the Bering land bridge, it again following those climate shifts, but it's came and gone many times over the last few million years. Horses would probably be extinct today if not for the fact that they made it from the Americas across that bridge like a couple million years ago. Camels did that as well.
Did camels also evolve in North America?
Mm-hmm. Yep. I like going out looking for rivers. You can find camel teeth out here in Kansas. You can.
Oh my God. I mean, that's so insane that horses, in such a roundabout way, they evolved in North America, made it across the Bering Sea land bridge, and then went extinct in North America, and now are feral in North America after crossing the Atlantic with various ships full of horses. Like, that is the greatest comeback story of all time.
It is. Those are the stories that make me find evolution so fascinating. Like all of these stories that are buried in this fossil record that I don't know. It's so cool. The camel thing. They think one of the reasons they were able to adapt so well for like that really harsh desert life is because of the adaptations they had to the Arctic. They already had the adaptations with the eyelashes that help keep snow and stuff. It also helps with the sand. The big feet pads that help them walk across the sand. That's the same stuff we use with like snowshoes. So dealing with like extremes in the climate because it's so dark and stuff up there for so long. It shows how this past world is still interconnected with this current world if we can kind of look deep enough into it.
I mean, why do you think that only megafauna has survived in Africa as opposed to in very other regions of the world? Yes, there is some megafauna in Asia, but for the large part, like besides bison, everywhere humans have gone, we've sort of deleted the megafauna.
Yeah. So if we bring up the bison and kind of compare the Americas to Africa, it's kind of two ends of the extreme where we see the American megafauna really vanish over a short time period of a few thousand years. By 8,000 years ago, it's a really different place here in the Americas. And it didn't take that long from the time humans got here and really began becoming more populated. I think that that ice-free corridor opening up really allowed for a lot more people to come in, that we really see them get eliminated. I think it has to do a little bit with the climate at the time as well. I think it was kind of worst case scenario for the megafauna, where the younger Dryas was going on, so they're already kind of fragmented in pockets. But to get back to the actual point here, in Africa, they don't have a sudden arrival of this new apex predator that they haven't adapted to that suddenly floods them. Instead, it's more of a slow, gradual evolution over millions of years. I think it's a more balanced ecosystem because like apex predators aren't a bad thing. We need apex predators. We weren't the only one there. We were avoiding lions and stuff, probably hunting during the heat of the day using different hunting methods. But I think it was a much more, I don't know if natural is the word to use for it, because we are natural, we're animals and animals migrate. But it's a more slow, harmonious change in Africa, I would say, versus the sudden arrival in the Americas. And then when you look at like the in-between, it kind of follows that trend. And there have been studies out there that there was a really good one just a year ago, because I used to be split. Was it climate? Was it humans? In reality, I think it's a bit of both for a lot of these, a lot of nuance, but it is pretty undeniable that as we look at the recorded history, when our species shows up, the megafauna declines, and it makes sense as to why.
Now, getting back to the story of humans, when you have Homo sapiens making it to the Americas, is that your sort of ending of this prehistoric journey that sort of the hominids have gone through? They've now spread across the earth. The genealogical exchange of genes is sort of solidified, that every single group is now able to interbreed. Everyone's sort of compatible in that way. And we have humankind officially arriving, or humankind, as we say today, the beginning of any attempt at civilization. Or is there still sort of migrations and serious spreading of, Homo sapien or Homo Neanderthal after this point? Or is that when it's done, sort of?
It's a good question. I don't think in the true sense, I don't think it's ever done. I think I kind of mentioned that we had some more boring phases throughout this period. And when we kind of like hyper focus on the last 50,000 years and this time of so much exploration, finding new humans, all of this stuff, it's a boring time right now. When we moved into the Americas, it is kind of, in a way, it's like the last major shift of taking over a huge area. Sure, like I think my answer here though is that like we're in a boring stage. Just imagine if we now move on to space exploration and like start colonizing other places, and then before we know it, we are almost like driving the evolution of populations to better be adapted for their different colonies on different planets. So like evolution is weird in the sense that there really is no end until there's a final mass extinction that takes out everything. So it's hard to put these labels of like beginning, middle, end.
Yeah.
I would say like it is definitely officially the time of sapiens, and maybe moving into the Americas and just kind of taking out that last landmass is a good point to kind of stick that flag. But
was there a large time period between Homo sapiens arriving in Alaska, essentially, and then getting all the way down to Argentina, to Chile, like crossing the Darien Water Gap? Like, yeah.
So that's a really good question. I love this stuff of like the humans making it to the Americas. And I think it's a good thing to talk about here because it's something that the waters have been muddied a lot, where people now think that there's like evidence that the land bridge wasn't used at all. The reality is we have really strong genetic evidence that populations were living on that land bridge for quite a while. And they were living in like the regions of Alaska that they could reach up on that land bridge. Then the question is when they made it from that pocket across where the ice sheets were, because they could make it into Alaska without crossing the ice sheets.
Huh.
The more recent evidence, and there was a really good paper a year or two ago that looked at like when human populations could have made it around that ice sheet if they sailed along the coast and kind of used kelp and that kind of stuff. So it seems like the group that was kind of settled in Alaska, some members at some point may have made that coastal arrival in. And I think, and this is where there's a lot of differing opinions in the field. I think it seems like, if this first group is moving into the Americas by using the sea, they're moving along the coast, they're passing this pretty less habitable region where all of this ice is and this big ice sheet's taking over the mainland. I don't see why you just stop. I think populations keep expanding quickly. I think they keep using the coastline and moving, and potentially it doesn't take that many generations. If you think about it, if you have the ability to just continue sailing south into new land to move that way. And I think that kind of helps explain a weird anomaly where a lot of the sites in the Americas, the earliest ones, have like been in South America. I think the first populations made it there really quickly. And I also think that there's a chance that they had kind of lived there for quite a while before this second wave comes in around 14 to 12,000 years ago, as the ice sheet is finally kind of melting and allowing for easy travel. I think that leads to a big influx. And I think there were some smaller populations that may have been absorbed or may have already gone locally extinct. But I do think there is some evidence that there were humans here that we don't necessarily fully understand their story, and they're here earlier than the main cast.
So, for example, a coastal navigating group made it down to South America very early, precursors to like the Incas and the Aztecs, versus the Great Plains Native Americans, who had a very different sort of lifestyle that didn't have many, like, since they were nomadic and they came down after the ice sheet. Or I'm jumping to too many conclusions.
Well, what I would say is that the Inca and like Aztec, that's the area that I truly don't like focus on a whole lot, but it is quite a ways after the stuff we talk about. I don't necessarily think that, in the sense that I think this early group that made it maybe 30,000 years ago, even 25,000 years ago, I think they were pretty much gone by the time of those, like the Inca and the Aztecs. I think the groups that came down and kind of flooded maybe kind of either caused them to disappear, or they were already kind of going extinct due to the other factors. There's a little bit of evidence with the genetics and the South American indigenous populations where there's some Denisovan admixture that really isn't accounted for in the North American populations. It could be something that upon finding more evidence, it's kind of cleared up, and we understand better that maybe there was a population in North America that we haven't really seen represented genetically yet, that it makes sense they came from. It could also be that that admixture is from a population that moved through Oceania 45,000 years ago, moved across the Bering Land Bridge, moved into South America quickly, and then they were in South America already without having that genetic link in North America when that group came in. And then they interbred with them, and now the groups in South America have it. That's one story that could account for it, but it truly just is a little bit of an anomaly we don't understand.
Wow. I mean,
what I would point out really quick, because people take this sometimes and they think that because they have the Denisovan DNA that's connected to like Oceania, they try to use it as proof that people sailed from Australia to South America. And it doesn't suggest that. It suggests they got the admixture around 40,000 years ago in the region that Denisovans would have been. but that still kind of fits along with the idea of moving up through that region to get to Siberia and Beringia.
Well, isn't it true that that sort of those peoples who settled like through the Indian Ocean are more related to the people who settled Madagascar than it is like they were? I saw something about that.
I don't know. I truly don't know. I haven't ever came across anything like that, but it's also Madagascar populations aren't something that I've really looked into the genetics.
Right.
So I just don't know.
So getting back to Homo naledi, and so if you've seen the Netflix documentary, and check it out if you haven't, if you're interested in these types of topics, they basically are saying like, hey, we have a group of pre-Homo sapien hominids who are burying their dead and basically showing almost like a sort of religion. What is your thoughts on this? Like, do you think they made the right assertions, or they made a lot of jumps? Like, were they not the only ones to be doing this type of behavior, or is this quite common in these sort of groups?
It's a good question. It all comes down to whether they were doing that behavior. And that's kind of where we need the team to continue working down there, because all of the evidence comes from such an isolated place and it's hard to work in that place. So the progress is slow. But I'll preface this by saying if they truly were burying their dead down there, if they truly were using fire and using stoves to cook their food, I think it really shifts our understanding of brain size, because they have such smaller brains. Mm-hmm. What I think it kind of should do, though, is make us realize, and again, but like all of these humans within the last 2.5 million years, we were a lot more human-like than we often give credit. They weren't just, and really, I feel like we've done this with all animals. We act like it's just everything's instinctual, and we kind of have treated it like Erectus and habilis maybe the same way. Mm-hmm. But really, it seems like these humans, like this ability to be so intelligent and creative and thoughtful, it could be a really old trait that we just haven't really seen a whole lot of evidence for, because it's hard to find that evidence. And the evidence, I mean, we only find such a small fragment. I really think there is the potential that there's just so much more to this ancient humanity. The fossilization of wood is really rare. And there could be this entire time period where these ancient hominins are using wood pretty intricately. And because we don't find that evidence, we just assume they aren't really doing much at all. But just a year ago, they found this platform in Africa that was made out of wood and some pretty almost like Lincoln log type stuff.
Right.
And it was like 500,000+ years old. And it's just like, it was only preserved because it was in a very specific environment. Maybe this stuff that we like to pretend is like, it makes us special. Maybe this stuff has been in our family for a long time. Or you go, and then I'll get to another Naledi thing that I think could be an interesting.
Then I'll let you finish. So
with Naledi, I mentioned that they have traits that are very, very not human-like.
Right.
They have things that when they first found it, they thought it was like a 2 to 3 million year old fossil, until different dating methods kept returning 200 to 350,000 years ago.
Yeah.
So they have a lot of traits that are Australopithecus-like, but they have a lot of traits that are really like sapiens and even like Neanderthal-like. So we know hybridization happens. There was, they think a proboscis monkey and a silvery langur, those two monkeys are split by 8 million years. Mm-hmm. They hybridized, had fertile offspring. They think anyways, it hasn't been genetically proven, but like blue and fin whales, they hybridized. Yeah. They're about equally separate. Australopithecus and the Homo genus, we diverged 3 million years ago or so maybe. I think it's potentially possible that Naledi could be like the result of hybridization among Australopithecus and the more human like genus that kind of led to this strange kind of blend of two that persisted. Because all of the evidence suggests the Australopithecines went extinct around 2 million years ago. So that's a big gap. But I mean, I think it's possible. I think we could eventually prove it. They're working on trying to get genetic information from Naledi and from Australopithecus sediba. And if we could like prove that there was hybridization, I think that'd be a pretty cool look at this species that's like blend of our past and our present.
I mean, I guess like it's too black and white to determine like when a species starts and when it ends. So if this was a hybridization, I mean, would it be a step back in evolution or would it be a step forward? I think that might be the wrong way to describe it, but like,
I mean, with evolution, we're always oversimplifying if we try to because at the end of the day, it's just all about what works. But we have, I don't know if you know much about mammoths, but like there's the woolly mammoth, which is the commonly known one. Mm-hmm. There was a bigger one that's called the Columbian mammoth that lived further south. Just a second. Cat's drinking water. We can just leave this in. It's just some hybridization. The Columbian mammoth, we've actually got genetic evidence now that shows it was the result of hybridization between woolly mammoths and another species of mammoth. So the offspring were actually successful enough to lead to a new lineage. The Narluga is a potential example of that as well. Narwhal beluga whale hybrid. We only have a skull, but they've been able to get genetic information and confirm that's what it is. They've got these really weird teeth that kind of like stick out from their mouth because it's like a blend of the two species. And they actually did like isotope analysis on those teeth. And they were able to show that individual was like consuming food from the bottom of the seafloor, almost like they were sifting along the sediment and like getting their food that way. So why I'm bringing this up is that like potentially, if that was a better way to survive in that environment, the hybrids could lead to a successful new species. So I wouldn't say hybridization is necessarily going back, but it's like pulling back on some tools from the past to create something new.
Now, did this narwhal beluga hybrid, did it have a narwhal tusk?
So no, it's if you pull up a picture, they've got a picture of the skull. But it's got teeth, and it's got like, I want to say it's like half the amount of teeth you would find in a beluga whale. But the narwhal tusk is a tooth. So it's a tooth that goes through the mouth. So the teeth of this Narluga, there's a lot of them, but they're kind of like twisty and mangled looking almost. So it's like a blend.
Now I'm seeing it. Yeah. No,
and they only have that skull because a local hunter at some point had killed a couple of them and kept the skull because it was just like he didn't know what animal that was. Weird hybrid. We don't know if they're fertile or not, but they exist.
Now, what do you think about the idea of dogs and Homo sapiens bond with dogs, giving them the leg up against a lot of the other hominids like Neanderthals or Denisovians? Like, is there evidence that domestication occurred before Homo sapiens interacted with Neanderthals? Like, there is a theory that I like to think that dogs and humans like evolved next to each other almost, and that like the one point was that Neanderthals were nocturnal, some people suggest, and that Homo sapien camps were kept safe by dogs at night because they would be able to alert them to Neanderthals approaching. And I just love this idea of dogs and humans beating Neanderthals in Europe. I just think that's a hilarious concept.
It is a cool take on like what gave us our leg up, the idea that it was this pet. Dog domestication has been like famously hard to pinpoint because gray wolf populations are so expansive. They have been trying to find out as much as they can. And what we can say that kind of adds to this is it seems more likely that dogs were domesticated after Neanderthals went extinct. I was actually just looking into a review of like the most recent information, a paper from 2023. and they listed the potential domestication as being like 32 to around 15,000 years ago. I have seen some sources that suggest like 40 to 50,000 years ago, which would be kind of putting it towards the tail end of the Neanderthals. But I think it kind of seems more likely that they were something that occurred after the Neanderthals. Now that region is ours, the region where those wolves are. And it's interesting to think, like, could Neanderthals have done that? Is there, like, here's something cool. South or Native American populations, they had their own dog breeds.
Right.
They were separate from the ones that we brought over, but we pretty much took them all out either on purpose or on accident. So like, could Neanderthals have done that? Did they maybe have dogs of their own and we just haven't known to look for the evidence or found the evidence? The genetic evidence would be more degraded. It's one of those things that I don't know. It's maybe we miss the forest for the trees by thinking like it's something special to us. Maybe these other humans had actually done it as well. I don't know.
I mean, imagine Neanderthal dogs. Like what yeah. Do you think they would look like? Imagine if Neanderthals invented the lap dog. They're the OGs running around with like little lap dogs in their bags.
My brain was going the opposite. I imagine massive.
Yeah, like of course the Neanderthals would have these massive dogs, but it would be way more funny if they had these tiny ass dogs that they like brought with them hunting.
Little like Chihuahua looking things.
I mean, Chihuahua is probably one of the only New World dogs that have really lasted, right?
Genetically, there's like the Chihuahua and I might mispronounce, but it's like the Zoho. Yeah. It's XOHO. The genetic evidence seems to suggest that those are almost like remakes where like they aren't necessarily strongly connected to the ones that were there. Mm-hmm. Now there may have been hybridization going on, and I don't want to get too far out of my reach with dogs, but what I will say is that the evidence actually seems to suggest like the Native American dogs were exterminated, including those that we typically think of. And I don't know, that might cause some controversy. It's just what the genetic evidence has suggested that I've read. But there's the exception to that is a tumor. There's a tumor that dogs can get, and genetically it still has the same like genome sequence of one of those ancient dogs. So it's kind of like the Last Revenge, this tumor with a weird genetic sequence that's still
Montezuma's Dog's Revenge.
Yeah. Yeah.
Jeez. I mean, this is some seriously fascinating stuff. And going through your TikTok, you've gone through so many topics and very expansive. And like, are there any ones still today that like you were like, that was the coolest thing I've ever learned?
Oh man. So my process is basically like, I like to just kind of read the like Science Daily is a good aggregate that just kind of, when stuff gets published, I can sort it by strange, paleontology, archaeology, just kind of all of that stuff. I would say here's the thing that changed me the most. Now I'm not a vegan. I eat meat. I just had a rotisserie chicken, but there were some papers that came out a few years ago on pigs. And like one of the papers was they were able to teach the pig how to play a video game using a joystick. The joystick was meant for chimpanzees, and it was able to, they have pictures of it using its snout. So it was able to do this. But the part that really messed me up is that they looked to see what would incentivize it more when it was struggling and when it was kind of coming to a point it couldn't persist. And what it cared more about than food, what drove it, what motivated more was like the people cheering it on, and it would perform better. And to me, it's just like, it almost makes me feel like in a lot of the papers I've read, it almost makes me feel like we have created this simplified form of animals in our mind so that we feel better about what we do. And just reading some of these things, it's just like, dang, we're special, but there's like empathy and feelings and emotions with animals. And even there's been papers I've read on bumblebees that like show the intricacies of the bumblebee mind. And it's just like bumblebees playing. Just, I don't know. So I would say like those behaviors has really kind of changed my outlook as, I don't know. I changed my view of the world a little bit.
Now, I mean, I saw some crazy theory that pigs might be half human. And that's why all the books, religious texts say don't eat pork. That they're like hybridized. Yeah, it's wild. But like there's like this gets weird, but like they're like super intelligent. They have social structure, but like it was just a take I saw. I don't even remember where I saw it, probably on Twitter from some like crazy account that like pigs share a lot of human DNA and that like aliens may have put them here after hybridizing. And they're like, look at the pink skin. Like it's
So I'm pulling something up just so I make sure I don't want to mess this up.
Yeah.
First off, it goes against all of the evidence. It's kind of one of those things that's just crazy, but that gets pushed. But I don't know that I'm going to find it. There is a dude who has been like going at me for years that runs this website that pushes all of this crazy, like hybrid type stuff.
Yeah.
And that's one of them. And I want to
I don't know where I heard that. It's definitely BS.
Yeah, it is. But the funny thing is, and I'll just leave it because I don't want to give him more reason to come after me, but he has connections to like the political world where he has worked with people. And this dude has ended up in my DM and he has this crazy web. It's insane. But yeah, so
could you give me his contact? Because having crazy people on is good for a podcast. Because
I don't know that I want to give him.
But
airwaves.
I mean, you have had. So I saw that you had some input on Graham Hancock's, basically his adversary that was brought on Joe Rogan, this Dibble guy. What exactly is going on there? I mean, we haven't heard much from it since, but there's been a good large part of the Twitter community that's found this out. So what's the exact situation on that?
So just for some context here, like with Graham Hancock, I don't hate the guy. I have his book sitting across from me that was a gift to me at one point because I used to be really interested in a lot of his stuff. Mm-hmm. And over time, it was actually during the pandemic, I was taking in all of his stuff on YouTube I could find, Joe Rogan, whatever it was. But it was when I heard him talking about Denisovans where it kind of came off as someone pushing something that directly went against what I knew the evidence suggested.
Right.
So that was kind of my shift away from Hancock to more like wanting to look and see more about what he was saying. And I had a big shift in some certain things like the comet impact hypothesis as I kind of saw behind the curtain, I guess. Then with Dibble, my first interaction with Dibble was actually regarding Naledi because I was big on Naledi and I have a platform where I reach a lot of people. So I take that seriously. I try to put everything out as accurately as possible. But with Naledi, I jumped the gun a little bit. I was showing all of this evidence of fire, all of this evidence that Lee Berger had presented because I'm a school teacher. Lee Berger has a good reputation. I kind of took it and I went with it and I was sharing that stuff and it wasn't peer reviewed yet. And Flint Dibble had a lot to say about it. And I initially kind of responded as if he was just like an old cranky dude that just kind of wanted to hold on to the views from the past. And I realized I was wrong. He ended up making a long video about like why it's premature to make all of these claims. And he was right. So that was my first interaction with Dibble. That was kind of my first interaction with Hancock. Then they both end up going on Rogan. And really Hancock shows up unprepared for the debate, it seems like. I think a lot of his fans would agree that like his downfall was kind of that like all of his points were about like being called racist or being called white. So he wasn't addressing the actual archaeology arguments. It was this kind of emotional kind of response. And Dibble came with evidence and Dibble did a really good job of showing like that we do know a lot about this time period. And there is a lot of evidence and there's a lot of stuff we can pull back on to say, no, we don't think there was a global ancient civilization. The evidence, especially genetic evidence, does not support that. The fallout from that has been that some minds were changed, but a lot of people just kind of continue on their teams. I've seen a lot of kind of shifts towards, and this is where I kind of want to defend Dibble a little bit, because especially just these last few days, I've seen a lot of this where people are pointing like to 2 or 3 things that he said that may not have been entirely accurate. And it's with the territory, with all of the nuance. If you want from a 2-3 hour podcast, you're going to be able to find things like that you can kind of say, well, this wasn't completely true. So it kind of seems like at this point, we're hung up on some nuance behind a few points that may not have been true. I don't know. I haven't paid attention to those videos, because at the end of the day, like, I felt really comfortable coming on this podcast with you. But going into a debate like that on Joe Rogan with someone who has talked so much about this topic and is so good at talking about this topic, that would be really tough to do. And if you are wrong about a couple of things, it's not necessarily that you're lying or that you're trying to mislead. I'm sure I will probably end up finding out I was wrong about 1 or 2 things during this conversation. So I don't know. I think people are, I'll use the phrase again, missing the forest for the trees, where they like point to one thing like, oh, gotcha, Dibble, you were wrong about this. When you sit back and you kind of look at the entire thing, what Graham Hancock has is a cool hypothesis that's not really supported by evidence. And he seems to be pretty willing to accept that it's just an idea. He's a journalist. He's putting this idea out there. The bigger issue for me is then the people who take what he puts out and then like take it as fact. And I get that all the time, where it's like people think I'm lying, or people think I'm paid by the big archaeology to like keep this secret hidden. So I don't know. There's just kind of like a disconnect between with everything, the more extreme end versus the rest of the people. And I don't know, the more extreme end of that debate, I don't know, you're never going to make them happy. I think Dibble did a pretty good job. I think if you want to kind of get a good idea for how archaeology works and why it's not all just like guessing about certain sites, it's a pretty good kind of video to watch. My first interaction with Dibble was him kind of getting on me, but he's good at it. He shows kind of the nuance there, the complexity.
But what are these allegations that Dibble was a fraud from the jump and that he just had 5 fallacies? Like, what are they trying to say about him?
All right. So I have, as a science teacher, I have a lot of people who like treat me as enemies. And so we'll get into Dan, who is the video of the 5 things.
Right.
I haven't watched his video of the 5 things. I used to have a pretty good relationship with Dan. I saw him as someone who was kind of trying to put the truth out and kind of trying to stay in the middle. This whole Dibble thing really kind of shifted my view of Dan's content. I watched his video on ancient DNA, which is, I think, probably one of those 5 fallacies, because he presented this ancient DNA from the debate as Dibble lying and making huge, huge claims that aren't supported by the evidence. That's something I do know a lot about. So I was doing cardio. I turned the video on because I get along with Dan well at the time. I watched the whole video. It was bad. It was using a lot of papers from like sub 2010, taking the finds from that and like implying that that's still the limit of what we can do today, when in reality, the field of ancient DNA has gone so far since then. We didn't know about like the interbreeding of Neanderthals. We didn't even know about Denisovans. We didn't have all of these capabilities we have today. So I guess getting back to that video, like I said, I haven't watched the 5, but from the same creator, when he has made videos on subjects that I do know really well, I have found them to be very misleading. and be very much like trying to score points.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it did kind of work out the way this creator wanted, where now he gets a lot more views because Graham Hancock is pushing this video as like proof that he was conned. I think this was probably the fastest growing fuller length video he's had in a while. My answer to your question would be, I think that a lot of those are being pushed by people who want to change the narrative from Dibble explaining archaeology to Dibble lying about everything, or even just a lot of the stuff. And I don't think it's fair. I think it is misguided. And like going back to that DNA evidence video, if I were to watch that video without knowing what I know, I probably would have been left pretty convinced, because he's using real papers, like pointing out the stuff from the paper that supports his claim. But what he leaves out is the 15 years since, where we have kind of moved past our archaic abilities. And we really like think about everything I've told you today,
right,
that we've learned through ancient DNA. We weren't working with ancient DNA during the time that a lot of those papers were published. So it's just, it's apples to oranges when you say that this is our ability. So to claim we can know these things, what it specifically was about was the claim of like, we could see if humans or other organisms had made it to the new world by like the DNA admixture and stuff. And the video claimed we wouldn't be able to see that, when we would. If we found them, we could test them. We could show that, oh, this group, they were here from over there way before than we expected. How did this happen? Or even like with admixture of like, we could find potentially ancient admixture from cattle into bison or something. If this global civilization was like helping people, they'd be bringing stuff with it. The DNA does not support it at all. And it's just, I don't know. It's just...
No, it's interesting because there's a lot of people who they're like so convinced there's an ancient civilization. And the thing is, like, I think people miscategorize that because, like, for example, like Egypt was like, we're closer to Cleopatra than Cleopatra was to Egypt. And they already had Egyptology as a study when Cleopatra was around. Like we don't know. And I mean, it doesn't support it with this like overarching like theme that there was a global civilization that he talks about, which is kind of ridiculous if you kind of think about it. Like we don't even have a global civilization now. Like, so, but one thing I wanted to ask, moving on from that, is Neanderthals, right? If we did do interbreeding and like, let's say Denisovians as well, what does that DNA accomplish in our modern day? Like for example, some people say that all Neanderthals were gingers, and I like to run with this. I think it's funny. Like if red hair was really from Neanderthals, like that would be pretty funny. Like why do people think ginger, like, you know, quote unquote South Park, gingers have no souls? Because like we just we're not compatible on like a species level. Like I just always found that funny.
So I was actually just reading a John Hawkes article about the red hair and Neanderthals yesterday. And essentially it kind of stemmed from an early paper that thought I think they did find evidence in this Neanderthal they got the sequence from, that they had the mutation leading to red hair. So they kind of ran with it as like Neanderthals had this mutation. And crazily enough, at least based on what I read yesterday, like that has been the only Neanderthal so far that was found with that mutation. So, which is, it's kind of funny that that's how it worked, that we find that one first. Phenotypes like that can be tough because evolution can happen convergently. It doesn't always have to go the exact same route. So if we're just looking for something that's the exact same mutation to determine red hair, it's less likely to find it. But getting to your question, there is evidence that like some pigment phenotypes were incorporated from Neanderthals into sapiens. A lot of people think we got our white skin from Neanderthals, which the evidence doesn't support that. The evidence actually supports that arose less than 20,000 years or so. So after the Neanderthals went extinct. And I should add some nuance that I'm just talking like the pale white skin. there was always going to be like lightening and darkening of skin tones, because skin tone is a really, really strongly selected for adaptation based on where you're living, UV, sun, rickets, vitamin D, all kinds of folate, all kinds of interactions there. Some pigments we got. A lot of autoimmune type things. So like if you think about it, when we were encountering the Denisovans, if they're living in tropical climates, islands, they have been adapting to the life there for a long time. So they are more likely to have mutations that help them with, I don't know, whether there were diseases mosquitoes were spreading or something. Mm-hmm. So like those kind of immune system things we seem to get. One of, I think, the coolest things is it's sometimes called like the superhuman gene, and it comes from Denisovans. And it's most commonly found in sapiens living up on the Tibetan Plateau, which is where we have evidence that Denisovans were living 100,000+ years ago. So this was their kind of spot on top of the world. And then once they interbred with sapiens, they added that admixture, and it was just kind of slowly getting watered down over time. And it wasn't until less than like 10,000 years ago when actually a population living near the Tibetan Plateau migrated back up to it. And what we see is really strong selection on this Denisovan variant that helps them breathe at that really high altitude. It helps them with like giving birth. They're able to give birth more successfully up there. So this gene variant that came from Denisovans, it's like the kid that does nothing on the school project but gets the entire like good grade. It really is because they evolved these adaptations over time. We kind of swiped them during this little brief period of interbreeding. And then now today, they are still helping people survive up there. Different species of person.
Does this include Nepal? Like, is this the Gurkhas?
When you talk I'm more ancient. So like when you talk the modern groups, I do know there have been some recent papers. It's the EPAS1 gene. Let me just look really quick.
Because I know the Gurkhas and this is like quite like the Gurkhas are some of the greatest warriors on earth. Like they, in the British Empire, they were like considered the greatest fighters, but they also, I think, like if you talk to people who climb Mount Everest, like the people who live up there are much better adapted to the altitude, to the climate, and are much we have some Sherpas who've climbed Mount Everest like several times over and like don't even use oxygen sometimes. So
yeah, and then this is like another level to that, where like some populations have been adapting and gaining mutations that help them for thousands of years, and then this is just that separate level. In regards to like which, all I know is that the populations on top of the Tibetan Plateau, when they've been tested, have much higher frequencies than below, and it hasn't really been identified elsewhere. There are papers that I think have kind of looked more into that, what you're talking about. I'm not 100% sure.
No, but I mean, there's so much like, do you think that basically people think about humans leaving Africa and they think it's more linear, whereas it's more just like more of a soup that mixed up as opposed to like a general, like forward climb of like evolution? Like it didn't go from A to B to C to B. It like branched out, came back together. Like the story of humanity is so interesting in that way, in that we all it wasn't just a straight line. It was something out of chance, and like the only trait that continued on every time was just how much we wanted to survive. And that's like my favorite part about like the indomitable human spirit that drives us forward. Is just like, just anyone who wanted to survive was able to come together and create this amazing song and symphony we call mankind.
Yeah, dude. I think the famous picture of like that march of progress, of that like path of evolution, I think that has, I don't want to say hurt the field, but it just makes this story that is so amazing seem, one, so boring, but also it isn't a good representation because it does show it as this linear path forward. When, as you just described, in reality, this is like just showing, let's see, this is like showing the last million years or so. And this is the family tree where like this is modern sapiens down here. But all of this interconnection, all of this web is the stuff that's missed when we just like pretend it's this simple, we went from Australopithecus to habilis to erectus to Heidelberg. Yeah, in general, it was kind of that way, but there's so much more.
I mean, going back to like something I find fascinating is that nightmares may be epigenetic, passed down like phobias of like trauma. So like the idea that that monster that's chasing you in your dreams that you can't really like find what it is, it's really like a bear that your family was running from like thousands of years ago.
Like just deep past memories.
Yeah. Like
epigenetics is one of those things where like as a middle school teacher, that's above my level to where like I stick with, I think one of the things people like about me is that I don't pretend to like speak towards things that are just more advanced than I am. And when I've tried looking into epigenetics, that's what I've found. I don't understand it, but it's interesting. And what you just said right there, especially like the idea that we could be almost influencing our progeny by holding on to these memories.
Like if you were an ancient hominid roaming around the planet, what's the one top predator you wouldn't want to come into contact with?
Ancient hominid. If I'm thinking hominids, I'm thinking
anywhere on Earth.
Anywhere on Earth. Man, I really think it's the cats. I think it's the cats today. I think it's the cats back then. I think like Homotherium, many of the saber-toothed cats. Although I'm not going to pretend I'd have a chance. I don't want to run into any big cat, whether it's a lion or an extinct one.
I think the giant birds in South America are some of the most terrifying things ever. Just because the terror birds, just like, what were they? Just like 10-foot tall, large, carnivorous,
well-deserving
birds.
Of their name.
Yeah.
I think I would probably change my answer to that. The nuance there is that they never, just by a stroke of luck, or our ancestors never intermet with them because they went extinct just when South America and North America connect. They go extinct a little after.
But do we know that? Do we know that they never ran into each other?
I don't think we can say that. I think that's one of the things, and that's something I should say on here, is that, when we talk about when things went extinct, it's the last piece of evidence we have for it. But very well could have had terror birds living on some island somewhere or in some isolated population, and we just don't realize it. Or I wouldn't want to run into one.
Homo florensis running into a Komodo dragon, like relative, like a gigantic Komodo dragon getting eaten. I think that would be terrifying. That's the closest thing to a dinosaur that I think a hominid ran into.
And those Floresiensis, they did have Komodo dragons there. They also had relatives of the modern marabou stork that were like giant marabou stork. And you're 3.5 feet tall walking down to the river with this huge bird with a sword towering you, especially the young Floresiensis. You got to imagine they were a victim every once in a while to those things.
I mean, have you seen pelicans? Pelicans will swallow anything when they're hungry.
Dude, birds are gnarly. We don't give birds the credit.
Dude, they're dinosaurs.
Eagles. Yeah.
They're straight up dinosaurs. Like chickens will kill mice and they're dinosaurs.
They're theropod dinosaurs, and they don't forget it.
A pelican will like swallow a whole seagull if they can, or like a rat. Like when they want protein, they'll get however they can, whatever they can fit into their gullet, they're putting down their gullet.
Yeah. Every few years, there's one of those videos of even just like a street bird in New York that just downs a rat out of nowhere. And it's just like
a pigeon.
I don't know if it's actually, I just see, I can't think of what type of bird, but there's just these birds.
Red-tailed hawks, I think, have finally adapted to the urban environment. Like Pale Male is a story from a couple of years ago about this red-tailed hawk that made a nest that overlooked Central Park, and it was just picking off squirrels, rats, and like had fully adapted to hunting in the city. And that's very interesting. That's like miniature evolution in such a short time frame. I mean,
Yeah.
because
we're finding more and more that, the general idea is that evolution takes a really, really long time, but we're finding more and more it's not always the case. Even like with lizards, there some type of a knoll, maybe living in Florida, living somewhere around there, off maybe an island, I can't remember. But they were studying their traits over time, and this may have been like 20 or 30 years, I can't remember. But the more important thing was the length of their fingers. And what they realized is that when they looked from like the beginning of the experiment to the end, there wasn't much change that had happened. But when they looked, there was some change, just not much. But when they broke it into pieces, the evolution was happening much quicker. It's just that it was kind of going back and forth across time. So really, it does seem like evolution, especially like to urban environments, it's something that it doesn't take millions of years. These animals, they're surviving, some better than others.
I mean, what are some other micro evolution we've seen in like the past 100 years? Like there's other stuff, like aren't there humans with like a second, am I crazy in thinking this, but aren't there like humans, I forget exactly where, that are better adapted to swimming underwater?
Yeah. So the Bajau, to the Bajau real quick. First, microevolution examples. There's like the Italian wall lizard, which I actually studied because if anyone watching this is in the Topeka area, I want someone to study this population. It's a population of lizards from the Mediterranean that were released like 60, 70 years ago. And they've expanded across Topeka. They actually showed up at my school, like my third year or so there. Previous studies had showed that within it might have been like 40 years or so, they had evolved new structures in their the cecal valve, essentially helping with their diet when they were introduced to a new island. So that's one example of microevolution. But these lizards have been in Topeka, Kansas now for 60 years. And I think It would be really cool to look to see if these Topekan populations have changed from the Mediterranean versions as well. And then there's like lots of examples with like different fish populations. There's a Galapagos finch that they call like the big bird finch, which is like actual speciation across microevolution due to hybridization. So there's lots of these little examples, but the Bajau is a really cool human example.
Yeah.
And the physical changes they've undergone, and for a long time this was kind of debated, is this truly genetic evolution or is this just an ability they have because of their lifestyle? Well, they tested them and they found that the Bajau population, which really lives a lot of their day, or at least historically had lived a lot of their day at sea, collecting resources from underwater, their spleens were larger. And that is a genetic trait that we see in marine mammals. Like whales, they've evolved larger spleens. They also have duplications that lead to mini spleens. So these humans that had been more reliant on the water for so many generations had actually accumulated mutations that made their spleen larger. And the reason that that was beneficial to them is your spleen holds blood cells. Those blood cells can be released. So it's almost like having that larger spleen is like having a little bit more of a scuba tank or an oxygen reservoir, where you're able to get a little bit more of those blood cells to your body, which allows you to stay underwater a little bit longer, a little bit more efficiently. And then just over generations, the people who could stay underwater longer, the people who could collect things longer, those tend to be the people that are more successful. So it's just a numbers game where over time that mutation became more common and more abundant. And now today, there's legit a population of sapiens that is more adapted to life underwater than the rest of us. And they're not a different species or anything. It's just evolution is constant and populations are always kind of adapting. It's a small change.
One to do with humans, but like parasitic evolution that I thought was so cool was the difference between pubic lice and hair lice, and how different they are. And I think this is so crazy because they aren't related at all. Like crabs and lice are not the same by any means.
So yeah, people don't think about this, but like lice evolve alongside their hosts. So most mammals have like one type of lice that throughout this entire history of lice has been kind of associated with that host's lineage. When we look at the apes, we find one species of lice for orangutan, for gorilla, for chimpanzee. And then when we get to sapiens, there are two species, and one of those species is classified as like a different subspecies as well. So we'll get to the more interesting one, the really oddball, in a second. But those other two are a kind of cool example of evolution because it's head lice and body lice. So essentially, head lice is the more ancestral, kind of the one more like the original ancestor. And then once human populations started wearing clothes, lice started adapting to live in that environment. So body lice, the subspecies, are a population of lice that have descended over time to just occupy a different niche. The weird one is pubic lice, crabs. And this DNA stuff is what I find so interesting because it reveals so much. When they sequenced the genomes of these lice, there weren't really any surprises until we got to crabs, because crabs are more closely related to the lice of gorillas than the lice of sapiens or chimpanzees. We would expect them to be more closely related to our lice if they branch off from our lice. So the evidence actually suggests that at some point in history, crabs made it to our ancestors from a host that was an ancestor of the gorillas. Does it mean we hybridized or tried to? Doesn't mean that. It could just be an ancestor laid in the same bed. But at the end of the day, crabs came from an ancestor of gorillas.
I mean, that means some caveman tried to bang a gorilla and caught crabs. I think that's one of the funniest parts of this evolutionary story. Every family has a funny story, and our human one is that someone laid with a gorilla and got crabs.
Our story is that one that brought crabs to us.
Yeah, like every family has that one brother, sister that brings lice home from school and gives the whole rest of the family. That was us, but with pubic lice and gorillas at some point of our history. But that's what's just so awesome. Going through my notes. So what's the study about Neanderthal DNA being found in Africa? Because throughout this discussion, we talked about like Neanderthals were sort of in Europe, the Denisovians were in Asia. What is this sort of new evidence?
Okay, so this is another cool thing about this field is that we're learning new things. So if you go into it with the idea that you're never going to change your mind, it's frustrating. But when it comes to Neanderthal DNA in Africa, for a long time, the general idea was that, if your ancestors never left Africa, there's no reason to have that Neanderthal admixture from the hybridization that occurred outside of Africa. A paper published in 2020 tried to look at see if the genetic basis fit this hypothesis. So they looked at genomes from the 1,000 Genomes Project, got some different genomes sequenced from populations living in more isolated areas of Africa. And they did something different from earlier tests, which is that, I'm getting ahead of myself. So this initial one, they ran it, and what they found was that there was no evidence of, I'm trying to get this story right. Initially, it was kind of overturned, and they were like, wait a second, all of these populations we've tested, there is some traces of Neanderthal admixture here. And they explained it as it seems like the most likely scenario is that humans were always moving. The idea that we leave Africa and never come back is pretty simplistic. So the idea was that, as populations interbred, some populations were moving back in, and through that, this was able to spread throughout all of the population. So for a few years, the general understanding was that every human on the planet, based on the genetic evidence, had some Neanderthal DNA. And then it was just a year ago or so that a new paper dove into this, and they did something different that's important. They used a Neanderthal reference genome, so it gave them a higher ability to identify this and identify kind of beyond what the previous group could do. They did find these segments of DNA that the previous group found, and they confirmed that these segments of DNA seem to be across all populations. But there was a big caveat there, and that is that what the previous study had identified as Neanderthal DNA seems to have been misclassified as Neanderthal DNA. And in fact, it was DNA from ancient sapiens. Remember I said they had interbred with Neanderthals like 200 plus thousand years ago. So that happened. And then the sapiens admixture eventually makes up about 6% of the Neanderthal genome. So when this study was comparing the Neanderthal genome to these sapiens, when they were finding these connections and assuming that it meant they had Neanderthal DNA, chunks of those were actually not true Neanderthal DNA, but were like relict leftover segments from those early groups. So what I could say now today is that it's not entirely accurate to say all sapiens have some Neanderthal admixture. There do seem to be some populations, like really isolated populations, especially in Africa, that don't have that Neanderthal admixture. It's just made confusing by all of the nuance that goes into this. And you can see, like, with what I've just said right there, how trying to explain this stuff without going into all of the background stuff first can be excruciatingly difficult, because it's like you're not trying to be confusing, but like there's just so many places for misunderstandings to happen.
That is some like mind-blowing stuff, because it just goes to show that it isn't like one path. Like it wasn't the out of Africa theory is, I think we can call it, it's antiquated. Am I correct in saying that? In that it's like out and then back in, then out again. And like,
that's again where it comes down to this whole, like, not trying to be confusing, but just like when we talk out of Africa, we're typically talking to like either our genus starting out in Africa, which is pretty solidly evidence backed by the fact that that's where the Australopithecus populations were. That's where the first of our genus was. So that's kind of one thing. And then another thing that's often lumped into this out of Africa discussion is our species as a whole. I don't like to say out of Africa as a whole is antiquated. The simplistic idea that we used to teach is a bit outdated, because we are now realizing that like we're moving around. But the general idea of out of Africa is that like sapiens, we kind of get our start in Africa. And then as we move out and add these other chunks, like that's all part of our story. But I still think our story kind of starts out in Africa. But again, it's like there's so many of these things that if we sit around a campfire, you can like come to a conclusion really easily and understand each other. But then you could also argue all day with someone in the comment section about what is out of Africa. I would basically say with out of Africa, it's a big part of our story. It's not 100% of our story, but it's still kind of our origin continent.
So what do you say to people who are still like, we've kind of given up on the idea of evolution? I know Tucker Carlson has said this, but like, how do you neglect like everything that we've seen?
Honestly, my first thing in that situation is to kind of try to explain to them what evolution is, because to think that we have like gone away from the idea of evolution and we don't think of evolution as a true scientific theory anymore. Like you have to almost have some idea of evolution in your head that is separate from the reality, which is just that over time, populations slowly change genetically based on outside factors like the climate and the planet changing. Like I find very few people can actually argue that. Like, even if you look at like the medical field with like viruses, and not just like COVID and stuff, but with like the superbugs we have in hospitals, we can track the evolution of these different pathogens and how they adapt and evolve. They've done studies at Harvard where you can watch this sped up as like these different cultures evolve across a petri dish that has like different levels of essentially an environment that should make it impossible for them to survive. So when people come at me and are like very antagonistic about the idea of evolution as a whole, I really try to just kind of get down to the idea of like, well, do you accept that like today's modern dog breeds all descend from a dog population that was different? And most do. And then they get into like, well, that's microevolution, or a species will never change enough to be a new species, or dogs will always become dogs, but never cats and stuff. And then that's where you just kind of then try to take that next piece and break it down. Like, yeah, dogs will never become cats, but eventually a dog may, after enough time, look different enough that we consider it something different. And dogs are kind of a bad example of this.
I know, but like a pug, I saw your TikTok, a pug is way different than a wolf. And if you encountered a pug in the wild, I don't think it would never survive.
Yeah, it's not an animal that would live in the natural world, but you can think of like the processes that went into making that pug over hundreds of years. And those processes, even though we humans were the ones putting that pressure on them, it's not a different mechanism really than what happens in the wild, unless you think the planet never changes and sea levels never change and tectonic plates. If you think the planet has been stagnant forever, I guess you can then kind of have this view that the animals never change quite enough. But at that point, the argument isn't against evolution. It's geology. It's way beyond that. It's science as a whole, and like science that we've long accepted. I don't know. So there's some people you won't win over. I try to basically just simplify it as much as possible and get down to the basics of what evolution actually is, because the reality is a lot of people have never actually been taught evolution well. And if you're not taught it well, it's very easy to get misled by people like Tucker, or like there's the Discovery Institute that kind of is a lot of the talking points he pushes, but it's these think tanks that have their narratives they want to push, and they do a good job of swaying opinion.
I mean, you know what is the wildest fact I've learned recently is that science has never created another cell from scratch. Like
true 100% cell.
Like every cell we have is from another cell. So it's like, where the hell did the first cell come from?
Yeah. And that gets into abiogenesis, and chemistry is not my thing. And really abiogenesis seems to be more chemistry. I have a friend who's an astrobiologist who their job really interties with abiogenesis a lot, because they're trying to like study where life could be in space and how we could best identify it. But it's just, to me, I don't know. I don't think we ever figure that out, where life came from, how it got here. Like, how do we know it didn't come here from a comet, like from somewhere else, and then evolution continues here? It's too hard, I think, to try to replicate the conditions that led to this event of you and I sitting here. Like, we don't even know what the planet was like back then.
I mean, going off some of the other things you've listed, like, for example, wood frogs. I mean, I saw your piece on them. I always found them fascinating because they literally freeze themselves. How does something like that even develop? Just like all these frogs keep getting frozen and the ones that are able to defrost survive? Or
essentially, yeah. But I mean, it's probably like a less severe. Like right now we're seeing kind of the end of that line, or I shouldn't say the end based on what I said earlier, where there is no real end. But like, we've seen this behavior after it's been around for a long time. So yeah, it could start as simply as, this animal is living in a region where the conditions are year after year getting colder and colder. And you may end up, and I don't know in the case of the wood frog, but like in the case of evolution, there can be times where an event like this, you could have like the die off of 98% of a population, but like the 2% that persist and have some level of traits, whether it's a little bit more mass that helps them stay warm, whether it's who knows what it is. But if you just got that little remaining population that makes it through, now almost everybody for this next cycle has that, and their offspring are going to have it. And it shows how quickly we can kind of see shifts in population dynamics. At the end of the day, there's some very bizarre things that happen in the animal kingdom that are hard to explain through evolution. And I think it's just because we work with so much limited data when it comes to like understanding the past and understanding this book of life. So it's like, sometimes I just look at things in awe and I'm like, I don't know how it happened, but it's cool that it did. And I hope we learn some more.
I mean, something that is very interesting is like milk tolerance, the ability to process lactose. Like that exists in several pockets around the world, but is it basic, like just like whichever group of people were able to just like, they probably hit some sort of, and the domestication of cattle, I kind of get how you can domesticate wolves, just the nicest wolves that like, don't bite around you, aren't aggressive, will eat scraps and be very friendly. Like those wolves end up forming packs that are allowed, that humans tolerate around their tribe. And then, one day they end up like integrating more in that, if there's ever a bad wolf that will like bite a kid or bite someone, that wolf will get killed by the tribe. And like, that's how artificial selection starts in that point. But like, how did we do that with cattle? How did we choose what cattle were like the nicest and like the cows that were aggressive? Like, for example, like Cape buffalo are pretty closely related to, like, they look almost exactly like water buffalo and like other animals we've domesticated. But how were we able to choose like cattle? They're so large and like destructive.
Yeah, the ancestor of cattle was like a legit beast, the aurochs.
Yeah.
This massive wild bull with huge horns that's just not an animal you want to come up against back then. I think based on just kind of, I'm from a small town in Kansas, kind of close to ranching, that kind of stuff. My assumption with like the original domestication of cattle, we know it happened multiple times, multiple populations were able to get a population from the wild and kind of start from there. Does it just start with like creating boundaries and fencing an area in and then like trying to keep animals somewhat close to yourself so that you can then go out and hunt them a little bit easier? And then maybe the ones that are just more of a pain are the ones that you're just get rid of this one, kill it, eat it, just get it out of here. This is dangerous. And over time, you just kind of work with kind of like what you said with the wolves, just the ones that aren't as aggressive, the ones that naturally don't have as gnarly of horns. I'd imagine it's something like that. Even today, you can get some pretty unruly cattle, but nothing like the aurochs. I just don't think it was as simple as like they weren't going out capturing aurochs and bringing them to them. I think you kind of have to bring your domain to the aurochs, and maybe it starts out like that, and just they don't like it's just a slow process over time where this population is just getting a little bit smaller as they kind of take out the bigger ones, and eventually the ones that are easier to work with are valuable. They start to spread that DNA amongst other populations.
And when do you put that population in a fenced area?
Yeah, how? Maybe you have to kind of almost like find natural enclosed areas. Like if you think about like Native Americans using the environment to like have buffalo jumps or something, maybe it's like some type of
valleys.
Yeah. This isn't so much for the cattle, but like there's a population of Native Americans somewhere around Canada where there's like a bunch on the West Coast where there's a bunch of like islands, and they had these really interesting woolly dogs, and they would actually like leave them on islands and kind of they basically selectively bred these woolly dogs on these isolated islands for long periods of time
instead of sheep.
Like caves. Yeah.
Yeah.
Exactly.
For wool.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah. But so, yeah, maybe it was something more like that where you're using kind of what nature has given you to kind of corral them. And then from there, that's the first step. From there, it may be 2,000 years before you start to have noticeably smaller like it's just a slow, gradual change. But
then how do we start drinking milk? How do they get to the point where cattle are so docile that someone can just go up there and drink some milk?
It's a good question. I mean, that probably involved some higher levels of like carpentry to where you're able to kind of actually like keep them in place.
Yeah.
But like going to the part I can actually address more like scientifically, the evolution of our ability to digest milk is super interesting. And the reality is I used to kind of assume that it was just like the lucky few were drinking milk and the rest, they'd get diarrhea, so they weren't going to mess with it. What we've started to see more recently is that like I mentioned, lots of different populations, domesticated cattle. So like with blue eyes, or not, let's not do blue eye. Blue eyes, there's like one or two populations that have evolved this trait. With the ability to digest milk, it seems like something that lots and lots of populations have came to. That's a mutation that seems to kind of just be more likely. But what they found like a year ago is that they did a study on a lot of different pots and stuff, and they basically found that people were drinking milk for a long time before the mutation that allowed them to digest it, that allows them to digest that lactose later in life. And they found that the time when that mutation really expanded would be like during the times of the plague. So these people who'd been drinking milk, they'd get diarrhea. It's fine. They're getting nutrition. But then when sickness comes and starts wiping out villages, the people who are drinking milk and getting diarrhea, they're quickly getting kind of weeded out of the population by this plague because of the extreme dehydration. And then the post-plague population is more, the numbers game kind of plays the role there, where now you have a higher ratio and it just continues on. So kind of a weird example of we were drinking milk before the mutation, and then the mutation was really pushed forward by outside disease that kind of was an unexpected variable. Now,
is this the Black Plague or something earlier?
It'd be kind of like coming in waves. I wouldn't necessarily call and it may have been
just sickness in populations.
Yeah, just before. And it's like, I don't know. They did specify it as the plague in the paper, but I don't want to be wrong and say 100%. But yeah, I mean, just these waves of this severe illness that kind of come and take out the ones that can't digest milk and get their nutrition that way.
So I honestly, my notes, and I'm looking at my notes, I have so many topics and we're already at 2 hours.
We can do this again sometime.
Yeah, we definitely should. My last question, the orangutans, they're now being seen spear fishing. They're now being seen applying medicine to their wounds. Where are they on the scope of ancient hominids? Because they're using tools, no fire, using medicine. Where do we put them? Are they evolving in front of our eyes? Are they learning from other humans, like how to spearfish?
Some of the stuff does seem to be like observing and learning from humans. And I want to say the spearfish is something where it was kind of taught that. It didn't necessarily learn it on its own. I've seen videos of them like using saws that they have like just watched and observed and used. They'll kind of go into villages and collect like soap, and they've learned to use soap and stuff. When you ask where they set with hominins and stuff, all of this talk we've had so far is kind of connected by genetics. So regardless of what level they're at, they're always just going to be kind of another species of great ape. But I do think it kind of like what we talked about earlier, where these things that make us us, that we like to think are like purely sapiens and our species. I think this stuff has probably been around a lot longer. And I think it's like chimpanzees will use different tools they can find. I think it's more just that we are kind of opening our eyes to the abilities of these non-human animals that, kind of like I said with even like the pig earlier, like it's not just the apes that we're realizing are using stone tools more often than we thought. Like we're realizing this level of cognition across the animal kingdom is maybe something that we have been underappreciating and not giving. I don't know. I think it speaks more to everything else than necessarily them making a leap forward. I think it's more us shifting our understanding of the animal kingdom.
Like, you know, like Lucy, who discovered Lucy Leckey?
One of the Leakeys were like a really famous group, famous family of paleoanthropologists.
So like Lucy might have been way more advanced than our orangutan than we think. Like that their tool usage, like there may have been great apes using tools like Gigantopithecus, which like they might have been just as smart as orangutans. And like we actually haven't advanced entirely that much compared to what we thought cavemans did to what we thought. It was just a technology difference.
I think a lot of it comes down to like the environmental pressure as well, because if you think about like orangutans right now, a lot of these behaviors we're observing are from populations that are living much closer to humans than like they would like to be. So I wonder also how much of like this encroachment and the more stress on their livelihood is kind of driving this. Because like if you think about Australopithecus, if I compare your typical Australopithecus, what we know of it, to your typical orangutan, an orangutan doesn't have much of a use for tools and for this kind of creativity. They just want to stay up in the trees where the tigers aren't at, eat their food, chill. They got a pretty nice life until we start chopping those trees down and they have to kind of get a little bit more creative. So, you know, like Australopithecus is seeming to live in an area where they are less safe by the trees. They're having to deal with more of these external factors. So maybe it just all comes down to like the environment driving the need to kind of be creative.
Wow. Well, thank you so much for, you know, this amazing podcast. We're up to 2 hours. I think this might be the longest podcast audio cracks you've ever seen, but just a lot of great stuff here. Just like super interesting because this is the science you never really learn. Like it's filling in a lot of the gaps that like we've had so much, like even since I was in middle school, like there's been so much research done since then. And like learning new parts of it is just awesome. And just like we're really just a bunch of, you know, overgrown monkeys that brains grew from nutritional differences. And we're just interacting with a world that we've always been coming into new worlds, coming into new places. Like now we're in this tech age where we're going and interacting with things that we've never interacted with, but it's like, hey, like humanity has done that forever. Humanity's gone into new places and interacted, survived forever. So like this new age, this new place, we're still going to be able to do it. So thank you so much for coming on.
Of course. I appreciate you having me. It's why I do what I do, because like before I had the platform on TikTok, I would just like read these papers and it was like, oh, that's cool. But this has kind of given me a way to like show other people. And that's why I do it. Like I want people to realize how cool this stuff is, because like, if you don't know it, you don't know how cool it is. You're not going to go look more and learn more about it. And it is our story. Like we'd be a little better off if we all understood it a little bit.
Yeah. Well, check out Zeke Darwin Science on TikTok, Zeke Darwin on other platforms, Twitter, Instagram. Thanks so much for coming on. Crackheads, subscribe. Check out the YouTube. Please subscribe to the YouTube. Crack Maidens, thank you for listening. And thank you all.